I've grown accustomed to my mother-in-law's frequent jabs about my work-from-home arrangement. I'm Susan, a 32-year-old web designer, living with my husband John and his mother in the family home, which was once John's childhood residence. Before our marriage, I worked for a company, but after tying the knot, I transitioned to freelancing from home. Most of my projects come from referrals by my former employer and clients who appreciate my design work. This setup benefits us both. I avoid the daily commute and can better manage household responsibilities, and my previous employer remains satisfied with my continued contributions. Despite this, my mother-in-law is not pleased with my career choice. She clings to traditional views, insisting that a wife should focus solely on housework and supporting her husband. Times have changed, and many households now feature dual-income earners. John tries to placate her, but she retorts, "You're the one bringing in the money. She should be handling the housework properly." With a dismissive tone, she adds, "I doubt your wife's home business is earning much." My mother-in-law seems unable to grasp the value of my work, consistently belittling it as just a home business. I feel like I'm managing both the housework and my work effectively, but my mother-in-law's dissatisfaction persists because my approach to work doesn't align with her ideal of a full-time housewife. To her, I may seem like the intruder who stole her beloved son. Since the start of our marriage, she's been making sarcastic remarks and seems to disapprove of everything I do. John has shared that since his father passed away 5 years ago, she's become increasingly reliant on him. While he's clearly frustrated at times, he also seems to take comfort in being needed by his mother. Our home, located in a quiet residential area, was bought by John's father about 30 years ago. The mortgage was settled with his life insurance, and the house is now under his mother's name. It's the perfect size for the three of us and includes a room dedicated to my work, which is a significant advantage. My mother-in-law has lived here for 3 decades and has built a network of friends in the neighborhood who visit frequently. When they come over, I'm often pulled away from my work to serve tea and snacks. These gatherings usually turn into sessions where the women share their grievances about their daughters-in-law, adding to my discomfort. From my workspace, I overhear my mother-in-law and her friends exchanging stories about their daughters-in-law. My daughter-in-law runs back to her parents at the slightest issue. One friend complains, "She's only here about half the year and spends money like there's no tomorrow." We even had debt collectors at the door. It was a nightmare. I can't help but chuckle at their tales. They seem to be competing to outdo each other in describing how difficult their daughters-in-law are, with nothing positive to say about them. Meanwhile, the daughter-in-law they're describing is doing an impressive job balancing work and housework. When one friend praises my efforts, my mother-in-law's dissatisfaction is palpable. "She's not doing anything extraordinary with her work," she comments loudly enough for me to hear. "It's just a small home business. I wonder how much she's really earning." Another friend chimes in, "My daughter-in-law spends all her part-time job earnings on herself." A third adds, "The money my wife earns is hers, and the money her husband earns is for all of us." Their laughter fills the room. My mother-in-law then begins recounting one of her familiar stories from the past, and I put on my headphones to block out the noise. I've heard these anecdotes countless times and find them tiresome. More importantly, I can't tolerate the way they disparage modern wives. I focus on my work, tuning out the criticism and clamor around me. During dinner one evening, John brought up the idea of getting a new car. "I've been thinking about buying a new car. Do you think that's okay?" he asked nonchalantly. My mother-in-law, however, snapped back, "Why do you need your wife's permission to buy a car?" John quickly tried to explain himself. "Well, it's a car for all of us. I can't just make the decision alone, can I?" Buying a car is a significant decision that ideally involves everyone in the family, but my mother-in-law wasn't satisfied. She continued to argue, saying, "You're the only one with a driver's license, so you should get whatever car you want." John, who usually follows his mother's lead, glanced at me with a look of helplessness. I decided to step in, offering him some support. "You can make the decision yourself," I said. "It's okay to decide without constantly checking with me or your mother." John's tendency to seek approval from both me and his mother is both considerate and a bit frustrating. His father was a decisive man, making unilateral decisions, which my mother-in-law often complained about. Seeing this dynamic, John has grown up believing that being assertive is wrong. Conversely, my mother-in-law, who was accustomed to a domineering husband, believes that's how a husband should be. As a result, her dissatisfaction with John's indecision often seems to be directed at me. Susan constantly blames me for John's behavior. Susan is always nagging John, which is why he's become like this, she said, shifting the blame onto me. I was caught off guard and didn't know how to respond. John chimed in, adding, "Yeah, Susan's always complaining, and that's why I can't make decisions on my own." I stayed silent, even though I tried to defend myself. It was futile. John consistently sides with his mother. Despite being married for nearly 2 years, he has never stood up for me in front of her. When she's not around, he apologizes, saying, "I'm sorry, you're really the most important to me." But I struggle to trust him. He once seemed considerate, but now his lack of support makes me question our relationship. I'm beginning to wonder if continuing with John is the right choice. Kindness and indecisiveness are different, and I wish he would stand up to his mother. About a month later, John's new car arrived. The smell of the new car is the best. "Let's all go for a drive on my next day off," he said excitedly. His enthusiasm was contagious, and even my mother-in-law seemed pleased. "That's a beautiful car. It must have been quite expensive. But that's fine since it's coming out of your salary, right?" John didn't answer her question, instead delighting in exploring the features of the car. I stood there, astonished by the sight of the pricey new vehicle. I had told him he could decide on his own, but seeing his exuberance, I confronted him. "How much did that car cost?" He answered casually, $60,000. Noticing my stunned reaction, John added, "But you said I could buy any car I wanted, didn't you?" My mother-in-law quickly backed him up. "That's right, you gave John the freedom to choose, so don't complain now." I had indeed left the decision up to him, but I hoped he would consider our financial situation. Ignoring my mother-in-law's comment, I asked John, "Where is that kind of money coming from?" "Well, I'm financing it with a loan," he replied hesitantly. Before I could respond, my mother-in-law interjected, "Susan, don't complain. You're not the one paying for it." Her anger seemed directed at me for either ignoring her or questioning John's decision. With a fierce glare, she added, "You're such a disagreeable daughter-in-law, always finding something to complain about, even though you're living off John's salary." Tone was unusually harsh, making it clear that her frustration was aimed directly at me. "I have a job too," I retorted. My mother-in-law didn't let it slide. "What are you talking about? Your part-time job doesn't bring in much. John makes $5,000 a month." Her condescending tone felt like a personal attack. I was about to clarify that her figure was actually my salary, but when I looked around for John, he had vanished into his room. "I've been patient long enough, but I can't tolerate a daughter-in-law like you any longer." My mother-in-law's words stung deeply. I had been patient too, and discussing my salary seemed pointless at this point. The situation felt absurd, and I was fed up with both her comments and John's avoidance. Wasn't he the one who started this argument with his usual indecisiveness? "Fine, I'll leave then," I said. I went to my home office, quickly packed up my laptop and essential items, and left the house. "I'll come back for the rest of my things later," I told my mother-in-law, who glared at me with a menacing look. Meanwhile, John remained sequestered in his room. "Next time you come here, make sure you've signed the divorce papers," my furious mother-in-law shouted at me. "Did you hear me, you useless woman?" Her harsh words were a shock, as it was the first time I'd heard her speak so rudely. I chose to ignore her and stormed out of my in-laws' house. I wasn't sure if her anger was due to my decision to leave as she demanded or because I confronted John about the money. Regardless, I was determined to leave as soon as possible. I went back to my parents' house for the time being, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. My mother was taken aback by my sudden arrival. "I don't know what's going on, but you can stay here as long as you need to," my dad said, clearly sensing the distress in my expression. I didn't hear from John after that. The man who once cherished me seemed to have disappeared, and I couldn't help but feel foolish for not recognizing that he was a husband who always deferred to his mother. Talking to my parents helped me feel better and calmed me down. "You don't have children. It's better to divorce sooner rather than later," my mom advised, and I agreed. With my job providing financial stability, I wasn't worried about the future. That weekend, my father helped me move my belongings out of John's house. John was nowhere to be found, and my mother-in-law stayed hidden in her room. Standing outside my husband's room, I called, "Thank you for everything. Could you sign the divorce papers?" I slipped the papers under the door and waited. Moments later, his curt voice came from behind the door. I've signed them. Is this okay? Along with his response, he pushed the signed papers back under the door. I felt a pang of sadness as I realized our marriage had ended this way. Without saying a word to my mother-in-law, I left the house. Although I had lived there for about 2 years, the memories were fond. I headed straight to the city hall to submit the divorce papers, eager to finalize everything as swiftly as possible. After the divorce, I moved back in with my parents and continued working from their home. I had considered renting a place of my own, but my mother urged me to stay with them. It's much safer here than living alone, she said. My father shared the same concern. John and his mom are unpredictable. They might come looking for you. While I thought this was unlikely, I found comfort in being with my parents. Since my job allows me to work remotely, I decided to stay with them for the time being. 2 months later, having nearly forgotten about my ex-husband and mother-in-law, I started receiving calls from an unknown number. Who could that be? Maybe it's a wrong number, I thought, initially ignoring the calls. However, they persisted. Reluctantly, I answered and heard my ex-husband's voice. "Why did you answer the phone sooner?" he asked, sounding flustered. "Well, it's an unknown number, and besides, we're not related anymore, so I'm about to hang up," I said as I prepared to end the call. But he quickly interjected, Wait, I can't connect my smartphone." "Why is that?" I asked, noticing his desperation. "I wouldn't know. You should check with your phone company," I replied. Then a thought struck me. "Are you by any chance not depositing money into your bank account?" When we were married, I had deposited money from my salary into the account to cover public utilities. His salary was also deposited there, but it was so low that it barely made a difference. He was selling health food products on a commission basis, but his earnings were minimal since he didn't generate many orders. Most of his income was just the basic salary, which meant only a few $100s came in each month. I had been covering the bills with my salary, but for the past 3 months, the account had only seen his small salary. The argument about the car and my decision to leave happened midway through the month. The payments for that new car might have already started. My ex-husband on the other end of the line fell silent. "I've been managing everything with my own salary. From now on, you'll need to handle it yourself," I told him. I wanted to say, "Serve you right," but I held back and ended the call. It was likely that he never mentioned his true earnings to his mother. She probably didn't realize that since our marriage, we had been mostly relying on my salary. John must have been too embarrassed to admit he earned less than I did. I knew that utilities like electricity and water are usually the last to be cut off, with cell phone service being the first to go. A few days later, on a quiet weekend morning, the doorbell at my parents' house rang loudly. My dad answered the door and began arguing with someone. "We have nothing to do with you anymore, so leave," he said, his usual calm demeanor replaced by visible anger. Concerned, my mom and I headed toward the entrance. "I just want to see Susan," a voice demanded, and my heart raced as I recognized my ex-mother-in-law's voice. As my dad had warned, she had come to our house. When she spotted me, her face contorted into a terrifying expression, and she started shouting. "Because you stopped depositing money into the account, the electricity and water have been cut off." My parents and I were stunned. What does she mean, the electricity and water are cut off? I wondered aloud. At that moment, my ex-husband arrived, trying to defuse the situation. "Mom, stop it. This has nothing to do with Susan." But my ex-mother-in-law brushed him aside and continued her outburst. "John makes $5,000 a month. How could the electricity and water be cut off? You must be mistaken." "I'm the one who makes $5,000, I said, finally stating what I had been unable to before. My ex-mother-in-law's surprise was evident, and she turned to John. "That's right, it wasn't my salary. It was all Susan's," he confessed, his shoulders drooping in defeat. "What? How can you make so much with a part-time job?" My ex-mother-in-law stared at me with a look of disbelief, as if she had been outwitted by some clever trick. "I've told you before, it's not a part-time job. It's a real job," I said. My ex-mother-in-law's face went pale. "How much does John make?" she asked, her voice trembling. "About $500 net," John admitted, his voice barely audible. There was a stunned silence. Then, in an unbelievable turn, my ex-mother-in-law pleaded, "Susan, can't you come back? The whole leave us thing was just a joke." She adopted a submissive posture, almost as if trying to win me over with flattery. "What are you talking about? I'm divorced. I have nothing to do with you anymore," I insisted firmly. Despite my clear rejection, my ex-mother-in-law continued to beg, "You could just remarry John. If we start the paperwork now, it'll be fine." Before I could react further, my dad intervened. "We're done with you. If you don't leave immediately, we'll call the police." Hearing my father's stern warning, my ex-husband and ex-mother-in-law quickly departed. "If you come back, I'll call the cops right away," my father added as they made their hasty exit. "What a bunch of uncouth people," my mother exclaimed in disbelief, while my father's anger was palpable. "I'm glad you got out of that marriage, Susan," one of John's friends told me when I received an update about my ex's family. It turned out that John had sold the family home and land, moving into an apartment with his mother. The new car he had barely used was sold as well, and the proceeds from the land sale went toward paying off his remaining debts. While he managed to clear his financial obligations, he soon squandered the money he had left on gambling. Having blown through the funds from selling the family home, John disappeared without a trace. Meanwhile, his mother, who was left behind, developed dementia and had to be placed in a care facility. As for me, I'm doing well. I've settled into a fulfilling job and am living independently. Recently, I started dating a man I met through work. He's understanding about my past and is very dedicated to his career. Unlike John, he's not someone who relies on his partner's money for extravagant purchases. Although we're not engaged yet, we both feel a strong connection and see a potential future together.